Dave McCormick, Republican for U.S. Senate. Why are you running for this office?
Hey, Larry, how are you? It's good to be with you. Well, I'm running because I'm very afraid the country is headed in a very scary direction. And I think that it's really important that we get leaders of character, leaders who are going to step up and change the direction of our country. I ran in 22 for the same reason, but I'm running in 2024 because I think that the challenges, whether it's economically in terms of the sky-high inflation, or whether it's the border, which is completely chaotic and challenging our national security, or whether it's crime, which is rampaging in our cities and coming to the suburbs, or whether it's energy, where the policies that are being put in place are really hurting Pennsylvania and transitioning us to a different kind of economy that's bad for Pennsylvania and bad for the country, in my opinion. So those are the reasons I'm running. But it's more than that. It's also spiritual. I think that you look at the fact that most of our young people don't believe America's exceptional. You look at these kids marching on campus and don't seem to understand the difference between good and evil, right and wrong. And you have kids at Penn, Jewish kids at Penn, hiding in their rooms because they're fearful of violence on the campus. And you say, boy, we're heading in the wrong direction. How could that happen? And then you watch those college presidents testify before Congress, and you say, that's how it happened. The lack of leadership, the lack of moral clarity. So I think it's a moment where the country's headed in the wrong direction. We've had this before in American history, where America's been headed in the wrong direction, and we pulled it back. In 1979, when I was a young man ready to go to college, and we pulled it back because we got the right leaders in place. And this Senate seat in Pennsylvania is critical to Pennsylvania to have the right kind of leadership. It's also critical for the country to have the right kind of leaders in the Senate. So that's why I'm running.
How have conditions changed since your last campaign for the same office in 2022?
Well, if anything, I think it's gotten worse. If you just take the border as an example, which is something that when I walk into rooms, I started the campaign October 1st, and I'd walk in a room, I said, what are your top 3 issues? And on October 1st, people would say economy. Economy's number one. Inflation is number one. They still very deeply worried about inflation, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But right now, border has gone to the top of the list.
And now, as far as you're concerned, Dave, excuse me, try to isolate that into one issue that we ought to be concerned about.
Well, there's many, but the single issue that is most affecting Pennsylvanians is fentanyl. I mean, this fentanyl crisis, which is a direct result of the open border, is an enormous challenge. We lost 4,000 Pennsylvanians last year from fentanyl. We lost almost 100,000 nationally. To put that in perspective, we lost about 50,000 killed in action in Vietnam in 8 years of war, 100,000 Americans. So this is out of control. I went to the border during my last campaign. I was with the Border Patrol. I literally stood on one side of the Rio Grande and looked up in the hedgerows. You could see the cartel guys sending people across. And what happens is those illegal migrants come across the border. They apply for asylum. They're released into the economy. In 48 hours, often at the direction of the cartels, they find their way to northeastern United States, and they come down Route 80 or Route 81 or 76. And this fentanyl goes into small towns or big towns, like where I grew up in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, and it's destroying our communities. I go into most rooms and I say, how many people here were affected by fentanyl? About half the room had their hands up in terms of a family member or someone in their friend group. This is a devastating thing. It's an enormous national security threat. There's many problems with the border, which I'm happy to talk about, but that is number one.
Well, let's continue to focus on that just for a while, the flow of illegal drugs. So what kind of change would you recommend to our border policy that would address this very specific thing you described?
Well, there's 2 things, obviously. One, we have to secure the border. We have to stop the flow of illegal migrants across the border.
So how do we do that? Do we change the resources at the border?
Well, the number one thing, and this is proven because we have 2 cases here. We have President Biden and President Trump. And what happened on the first day of President Biden's administration, he put in place or overturned a number of executive orders which had resulted in a much more secure border. And so the first thing we need to do is have President Biden, exercise all the authorities he has. That includes building a wall of some sort that is a block. I went and saw where the wall had been and where the wall is not, and that wall is pretty formidable as a way of stopping the illegal flow. So that's the first thing. The second thing, which may seem radical, but I think necessary at this point, is I think as someone who's served in the military, we should use our military in a very targeted way to take out the cartels. And we have the capacity to do this. We have the drone technology. We've, in 20 years of war against terrorism, we can be precision. And this cartel activity, the fentanyl coming into our country, it's a national security threat of enormous consequence. So I consider using the military possibly in concert with the Mexican government, perhaps not, because there's worries that the Mexican government is compromised by the cartels. This is a big thing to say, but the size of this threat is so significant that I think our military should be considered. And if I was in the Senate, I'd be advocating for that kind of posture.
And I can see that your military experience is definitely influencing your position on border policy here. So why don't we explore your military experience? Let's take a step back in your history. And I understand you went to West Point. Tell us about your experience there.
I did get to West Point. There had been no one in my immediate family that had gone to, been in the military or gone to any of the academies. And it was worth saying how it started, because I played football and wrestled. Like every Pennsylvania kid, I wanted to be the star linebacker on the Penn State football team, and wasn't quite good enough for that. But I also was a wrestler, and I got recruited to wrestle at Army, and so I went to West Point, and I wrestled there for 4 years. I was the co-captain of the Army wrestling team, and that took me into the 82nd Airborne Division, and so I went to Ranger School. I became a paratrooper. The 82nd is our rapid deployment force. And I guess in 1990, I was out in Arkansas on a training mission. And it was the middle of the night, and I got a radio call. And the radio said, go to this grid. This gave a location.
Right. And you had no idea what was in store there?
Well, we knew that there was trouble in the Middle East, and we knew that there had been talk of Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait, and we were the rapid deployment force, so we were always on alert. But we didn't know exactly what was going on, and we took our equipment and our troops to a grid point. Airplanes started coming in and took us back to Fort Bragg, where I was stationed. And we got off the airplanes and cleaned our equipment and got ammunition and got back on the same airplanes. Couldn't talk to anybody, couldn't call home, and flew to Germany to refuel, and then Saudi Arabia. And my unit was the first unit to deploy along the Kuwait Saudi Arabian border, because at the time, and this goes to energy policy, at the time we were enormously dependent on Saudi Arabia for its oil. And the fear was that Saddam Hussein, who had already invaded Kuwait, was going to go past Kuwait into Saudi Arabia and take over the oil fields. And the 82nd, and my unit in particular, was viewed as the speed bump, because we were a light infantry unit. We were paratroopers. We didn't have tanks. But if Saddam Hussein would have invaded Kuwait and come against American soldiers, that would have brought America directly into the war. And so that was my initial
This
foray.
was the dawn of the first Gulf War.
This was it. Yeah, and my unit was there within the first 3 days, and I spent the next 8 months mostly in the desert in Saudi Arabia at various positions. We moved around a bit, and then ultimately was part of the first wave of troops that went directly into Iraq on the invasion, and that was, as you know, a very successful and relatively quick war, because we had this unbelievably formidable set of military capabilities, a huge coalition, a big air campaign where we saw the first precision-guided missiles on CNN, and we went into Iraq, and within, 17, 18 days, something like that, ultimately there was an armistice and we withdrew. And that was, for me at least, a very tangible example of the importance of military capability that is uniquely superior to our adversaries, but it also the importance of peace through strength. And by having strong military capability and the will to use it, we can hopefully make for a more peaceful world where America's interests aren't constantly being challenged like they are now, in my opinion.
So after you retired from the military, what did you do next?
Well, I retired, and my dad was horrified. I decided very abruptly. I came back from Iraq. I went to a training program for 6 months for captains. I was a captain at that point, and I had volunteered to go to Korea to be on the DMZ and command a unit there. And And the more I thought about it, I was applying to grad school. West Point had asked me to come back to teach after my Korea assignment and go to graduate school. So I was applying to graduate school while I was stationed in Missouri. And I kept writing the essays, and none of the essays ended with, and I want to be a career military officer. And it was a real moment of reflection. And so I had met my commitments. I abruptly resigned, and I put those letters in the mail. And the letters were for starting graduate school in September of 1992, rather. I'm losing decades here. Of 1992.
Take your time. There's a lot of years to recall.
1992. And I was sending these in October of 1991. And so I had a year from the time I would start grad school until the time I applied. And my dad said to me, what a disaster, because if you wait just 15 more years, you can get your pension. I was like, Dad, 15 more years. And even it was only very recently he thinks I made the right decision. But I had a year almost. And at the time, there was TWA, was an airline, it no longer exists.
Right.
And they had a ticket. It was an around the world ticket. It was $5,000. I had $15,000 saved because I was overseas for almost a year, and I got combat pay, so I had money in the bank. And I bought an around the world ticket. And the only rules of the ticket were you could take as many flights with them or their affiliates as long as you went in the same direction. So I don't know, it was probably over 20 flights over the next 9 months, and I went to the Middle East and Turkey and Syria and spent time in Israel and then went to Asia and spent time in Southeast Asia and China and Taiwan and really saw the world as a young man. And that set of experiences, I think, has helped me.
Now, eventually you went into business, so tell us about that experience and how it might inform your positions today as a candidate for U.S. Senate.
Well, when I finished graduate school, I came to Pittsburgh. So I was born outside of Pittsburgh. My whole family has been from Western Pennsylvania. So my dad's from Indiana County. My mom, I'm a seventh generation Pennsylvanian. My mom's from Punxsutawney, and they were both school teachers. And I was born in Washington, Pennsylvania, right outside of Pittsburgh. But my folks moved around a bit. And I grew up in Bloomsburg, which is, as you know, is near Scranton. And when I got done with graduate school, I applied for jobs and got a job in Pittsburgh. I had wanted to go to Pittsburgh. I had offers to go to different places. I wanted to go to Pittsburgh and had a real great family connection there. My dad had gone to Pitt. And I was a consultant with a consulting group there for a few years, and then joined.
You consulted on what kind of matters, Dave? Tell us.
Business, with industrial manufacturing kinds of businesses. A firm called McKinsey. I worked with everything from automotive to manufacturing to a variety of companies, and kind of learned a lot over a 2+ year period. But there was a small startup that caught my attention. It had been started by a couple of McKinsey guys. It was called Free Markets. And I joined Free Markets, and that became a wild ride, an amazing experience. The CEO and the founders took it public in 1999. I ran part of the business and eventually became the CEO. And we grew it, and I don't remember exactly, it was probably, 50 people when I joined, and we grew it to 1,000 people. And I was the CEO of that, and it was it was a software business and a services business. And the amazing thing about it, we had about 1,000 employees worldwide and about 600 of them in Pittsburgh. And the amazing thing about it was part of that Pittsburgh Renaissance, where you saw Pittsburgh really coming alive. We have a number of Carnegie Mellon and University of Pittsburgh graduates and graduates from local universities. We had our name on a sign, which was on the Pittsburgh skyline. And it was part of this amazing merger and partnership of old industry and new coming together, and Pittsburgh being a hotspot. And so it was an amazing decade for me in Pittsburgh. And I also I have 4 daughters, 2 stepdaughters, but I have 4 daughters, and 3 of them were born in Pittsburgh. So I lived in Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh, and it was an amazing decade in an incredible city.
Now, eventually you did some work for the federal government, as I understand it, in the capacity of a security advisor?
Yes, I had I'd gone to graduate school, and I'd done PhD and written a doctoral dissertation about reforming the military. And so when Governor Bush was running for president, I was asked and helped a little bit on the campaign and wrote a couple speeches about national security and wrote parts of speeches, not the whole speech. And so when he won a second term, I had sold the company as the CEO and had negotiated a deal where those workers stayed in Pittsburgh, and we actually grew the footprint in Pittsburgh. And I took a job in Washington working in the federal government. I had a couple jobs. The most notable ones, I was the Deputy National Security Advisor in the White House for economic and national security affairs. So that included everything from sanctions on North Korea to related investment policy. And then I had a second job, which was the Undersecretary of Treasury during the financial crisis. So I was in the middle of that when we literally thought the world and America was going to go into its second Great Depression. And so I saw up close and personal some of the amazing leadership in times of crisis. I also saw some of the terrible mistakes that got us there. So it was a real lesson in crisis management.
Let's turn our attention to another issue that's concerning Americans, and you hear about it almost every day. And of course, that's our current state of inflation. And try to tell me briefly, how did we get to the point that we're at right now?
Well, it's important to put this in context because when you see President Biden saying Bidenomics is working, the reason he's saying that is because the economy is growing and unemployment is low and the stock market's up. But for most Pennsylvanians and most Americans, it's a much worse economy today than it was when President Biden came into office. And the consequence, when we talk about inflation, what that is, of course, is prices have gone up. And for most Pennsylvanians, and wages have gone up less for most Pennsylvanians, and 60% of Pennsylvanians live paycheck to paycheck. So if you live paycheck to paycheck and fuel, food, and rent went up by 18%, and your wages went up by 14%, you're in a squeeze, and you have less money than you used to have when you're living paycheck to paycheck. And that is why inflation is such a crisis. That's why inflation is such an issue for most Americans. And there's two root causes. The first root cause is enormous spending. And if you look over the last 20 years, Republicans and Democrats alike,
government spending,
have been guilty of too much spending. Too much spending. If you look at the charts, you can see the spending going up. What's happened under the Biden administration is this. There's a hockey stick, and spending has accelerated. And even if you go, this isn't a political point, if you go and talk to Larry Summers or Jason Furman, who are Democrat economists that work for President Obama and President Biden, they will say that the spending is the primary cause of the inflation. The second cause of the inflation is essentially the war on energy. And so this notion that we need to transition the economy, pause the development of natural gas, stop the Keystone Pipeline, mandate that the government moves to solar and EVs and other things, has driven up the price of fuel dramatically by 60, 70, 80% since Biden came into office. And that is also the second cause, because fuel prices go into everything. When you see that the price of meat went up, well, the price of meat at the grocery store is a consequence of a number of costs, including the cost of fuel to get the meat to the market. Those two are the primaries, and there's obvious ways to fix it or unraveling those two policies. So we have to stop the spending. We have to get spending back under control, and I'd be happy to talk about how to do that. And the second thing we need to do is develop and open up our energy sector. And if there's one thing I'd like to highlight in this interview, it's that the idea that you can't develop our natural energy resources and protect the environment is a false choice. By developing particularly our natural gas industry, it's great for our national security. It's absolutely great for our economy here in Pennsylvania, and I can talk more about that if you like, and it's great for our environment because that natural gas is very clean, and when we export that around the world, it replaces coal-fired plants in India and China.
Now, our time is limited, Dave, so I'm going to move us on to something else that Americans are thinking about, and that's about our country's relationship with China. How should we go about those relations right now?
Well, listen, there was a bet made 20 years ago by Democrats and Republicans alike, and the idea was if the United States opened up its markets to China, and China opened up its markets to the United States, that'd be good for business in the United States because we'd sell into China. It'd be good for China. It'd be good for the American consumer, and it'd be good for our security. That bet proved to be terribly wrong. And it became much more evident that it was wrong when President Xi came into office, because President Xi essentially has adopted a posture where he wants to replace America as the global superpower. And when you go to the speeches that Xi has given, he's been there for more than 10 years, you can see that strategy is very explicit. And so what we need to do, in my opinion, is dramatically reduce our dependence on China. We can't have pharmaceuticals or semiconductors or any of the things we need to secure America dependent on China. At the same time, we need to hold China accountable for its bad behavior. We need to stop investing in China. Businesses shouldn't be able to invest in a way that helps the Chinese military or the Communist Party. And we also should hold China accountable for things like not sharing the origins of COVID. We lost trillions of dollars, millions of lives. Certainly the COVID originated in Wuhan. There's a lab in Wuhan. It seems to defy common sense that those two aren't connected. But whatever happened, the Chinese haven't shared the data, the information. And had they shared that, we might have saved millions of American lives, and we might have made the damage of COVID much less pervasive. So that's a new approach to China, and one that I would be a leader on because of my military background, because of my economic background. I've been to China, I understand China. My business at Bridgewater did a small amount of work in China. These are strengths. These are things that I'll bring to the table as the senator from Pennsylvania.
Let's talk about election integrity just for a minute. As you know, mail-in voting was not without its problems during our last election. So what are your concerns as this continues to be an option for Pennsylvanians voting?
Well, the Act 77 allows for mail-in balloting in a certain way, and Republicans have not embrace that, and we need to embrace mail-in voting. That is the law, as a way to ensure that we're able to compete and win in elections. But I think the concerns about election integrity are warranted. There's 67 counties. They have very different processes for how they protect. There's many drop boxes that don't have adequate oversight, and so and many Pennsylvanians, like huge numbers, half of Republicans, don't believe in the integrity of our elections. That's a horrible thing for our country. It's a horrible thing for our Commonwealth. So we need to take measures to both be much more competitive in mail-in balloting, but also ensure the integrity of elections to give people confidence. And so there's a whole set of initiatives to try to do that, to make sure the voting rolls are clean, to make sure the adequate inspection of voting machines and a clear custody of how the ballots are handled. And we need to make sure on Election Day that we've got adequate observation and adequate oversight of these drop boxes.
Let's get back to energy. We talked about natural gas a few minutes ago. How can America achieve energy independence?
Well, this is where I think President Biden and frankly, Senator Casey, my opponent, have been so off base. The environmental movement and the progressive left has pulled the Democratic Party in a direction that I think no longer makes any sense at all. And just to put this in perspective, the recent mandates that the Biden administration has put in place requires that 70% of all light vehicles by 2032 are EVs. I mean, that is an enormous transformation in our economy. And it does a number of bad things. The first bad thing is, by reducing our dependence on fossil fuels in that way, we're essentially hurting our energy sector, which our ability to export natural gas, the ability to have the security benefits of that, the economic benefits. Those fracking jobs in Pennsylvania are fabulous jobs. And then the point I made before, the export of that natural gas is great for overall global carbon emissions because it replaces coal-fired plants in China and India. The second thing that this does, which is madness, it makes us entirely dependent on China. 90% of the lithium batteries come from China. The large majority of solar panels come from China. So I think when we look back in time, Pennsylvanians will think this is one of the greatest misjudgments, strategic miscalculations of President Biden, but also of Senator Casey, to wholeheartedly embrace this without thinking through the consequences for Pennsylvanians, and I think they are dire consequences.
Let's talk about foreign policy for a couple minutes. How would you rate our government's handling of funding the war in Ukraine?
Well, unfortunately, I'm going to have to start with how we got there. And I think this is the direct result of the weak leadership of President Biden. And it started with Afghanistan, the withdrawal of Afghanistan, which was the signal and the inspiration for me to get into the race last time, and the weak signaling around Zelensky and Russia's invasion. So if you remember what happened at the time, President Biden said, we'll have to see how far Putin goes before we decide how to respond. Send the airplane for Zelensky so he can get out. Very slow support of Ukraine in the war. And so as a consequence of that, we now face a situation which is bad. So I'd give it a bad grade to your question. We're in a stalemate. I think it's very much in America's interest to have Putin not overtake Ukraine and have that victory. I think that's very chaotic for Europe, very chaotic for America's interest. I think it sends the wrong signal to China that we're not going to stand by our agreement with Ukraine from 1994. And at the same time, we're now in a stalemate where it's very hard to put U.S. dollars. I would support military aid to Ukraine, but it's been a mishandling of this and one that I think President Biden and Senator Casey own responsibility for.
We have less than 2 minutes left in our program. Okay. Use that time and tell our viewers why they should vote for you.
Well, listen, I think the answer is if you're satisfied with the status quo, if you think America's going in the right direction, you shouldn't vote for me because I'm not the status quo guy. I believe that we're headed in a terrible direction, whether it's those economic policies that we discussed, those energy policies, policies on crime, which you didn't get into, the insecure border, the weakness on the world stage. I think all of those are putting America in deep, deep trouble. And I'm very worried. I'm worried the America we all love is not going to be the America for the future. I'm running as someone who's been a leader in the military, a leader in business, a leader in the government, someone who doesn't owe anybody anything. Someone who is running to be able to serve the great people of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and will do that with no objective other than to get our country moving in the right direction, and someone who's going to advocate change. So this is a race between an independent leader, someone who's not been part of politics, someone who's had a demonstrated track record of success, and Senator Casey, who's a career politician. He's been in office for 30 years. He votes 98% of the time with President Biden. And so, as I said, if you like the direction of the country, you should not vote for me. If you want change and someone who's deeply committed, and by the way, I'll make one final point, not deeply committed to fighting for Republicans, deeply committed to fighting for Pennsylvanians with pragmatic solutions, with leadership for the future. That's what my campaign's about. Proud to be doing it, excited to be the nominee, and I think this is a change election. And I think 80% of Pennsylvanians think the country's heading in the wrong direction. And I think this is an opportunity for them to express their desire for change.
Dave McCormick, Republican for U.S. Senate, thank you for your time.
Thank you.